Okay, there we go. So recording this meeting, and it's going to save to my computer, and then I could probably post it to our Facebook page, which would be a good thing to do. So, and again, as mentioned, Tom Casey's down in Florida, so you'll see now in the monthly articles in the Bronx Times, our Secretary Dorothy Krenicki. So round of applause for Dorothy, round of applause for Tom Casey, who made his way into retirement, but we know you'll still be around. So, and with that, Madeline, let me pass over the screen to you. Make host. Here we go. I'm getting used to it now. All right.
All right.
So,
I can go ahead and get started.
Correct. Yes.
Is there someone who's a co-host, or because I'm seeing the admit button pop up. I can keep admitting people. Yes, I'm happy to do that.
So
okay, I'll do that.
Excellent.
All right, sure. Well, thank you so much, Rich, and thanks Tom and Dorothy for your help in organizing this. Yeah, I did. I think it actually may have been 2014 even I spoke to you, and I really enjoyed it. I'm very pleased to have with me today also my list and photo collection manager for the Wildlife Conservation Society Library and Archives. Sana, if you'll give a little wave. There she is. Sana will be speaking shortly, but just to get us kicked off here, I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to WCS and to the Library and Archives. So I will go ahead and get my screen all shared. Let's see. Let's see. All right. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. And you're not seeing all my notes and everything?
No.
Okay, good. All right. Well, we are taking you on a bit of a time machine ride this evening. We're going to be looking back on 50 years ago, 1972, as well as 100 years ago, 1922, to talk about what was going on at the Wildlife Conservation Society at that time. It's kind of a nice slice into some specific points in the history, but it also gives a bit of a representation of that history as well. And we've done these kind of time machine things a few times before, and I really love doing these. They often lead to a lot of great questions and comments, and please feel free to add those to the chat. It's hard for us while we're presenting to see the chat, but we'll be sure to get to anything that you leave there at the end of the talk as well, and have time for that. And all right, let's move on ahead. Ooh, wrong screen. All right, so Wildlife Conservation Society was founded as the New York Zoological Society in 1895, founded with 3 objectives. The third, I'll go backwards. The third was to preserve wildlife. They were recognizing the threats to wildlife at that time, even in 1895. The second was promoting the study of zoology. And the first was to open a new zoological park for New York. And of course, that became the Bronx Zoo, which opened in 1899. And folks may not recognize the name Wildlife Conservation Society, but you certainly recognize our headquarters at the Bronx Zoo. WCS also runs 4 other zoos in New York City, the Central Park, Prospect Park, or sorry, 3 other zoos, Central Park, Prospect Park, and Queens zoos, and then the New York Aquarium at Coney Island. In addition to that, WCS runs a large global conservation program. We're based in nearly 60 countries across the world and in all the world's 5 oceans. And this just gives you a sense of all the different regions that WCS is focused in, our priority regions at this time. Moving on, drilling down a bit into the library and archives. So Sana and I are coming to you from the WCS Library and Archives, where we work to advance knowledge in support of WCS's mission to save wildlife and wild places. And to do that, we help provide research and reference services, helping to support the research of staff, both at our zoos and our aquarium, and also in our international field programs as well. And then we also get the pleasure of preserving WCS's history and helping to share that history through presentations like the one that we're doing tonight. All right, so we're going to get into our time machines. I won't make you get up and whirl yourselves around or whatever one needs to do to travel back in time, but I'm going to turn it over to Sana now. Sana is going to take us back to 1922 and what was happening with the New York Zoological Society in 1922.
Okay, hi. So first we're gonna kind of get ourselves into the mindset of what was going on in 1922. So just generally in the world, the March on Rome happened that year, bringing the National Fascist Party and Benito Mussolini to power. The Ottoman Empire was abolished essentially when Mehmed VI, the last sultanate of the empire, stepped down, and that's a picture of him leaving. And also Ulysses by James Joyce was published that year. A little bit closer home in the US, that was the year that William Harding made the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. There was the Great Railroad Strike of 1922, and even closer to home, Yankee Stadium began its construction in the Bronx that year as well. And then now we're going to kind of transition over to thinking about the New York Zoological Society as it was known at the time, and what was going on there. And some also a couple statistics of what things were like in 1922. Oh yeah, we have some more fun about 1922 as well. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so also in the world, these were the films that were popular and came out at the time. Nosferatu was released, and Nanook of the North, which was the first, like, basically documentary of the time, as well as Robin Hood and One Exciting Night as two other films from that year. Music-wise, these were a couple of the top songs from that time. I have to admit, I don't know a lot about music from the 20s, so these came up as being popular, so that's what people were listening to. And now we'll look at what New York Zoological Society, as Wildlife Conservation Society used to be known at the time, was doing in 1922. So this was the board at the time. Most importantly was Henry Fairfield Osborne. He was the president. He was also the president of the main thing about board over right now, but the main difference between happened the look like museums built and opened in 1922. So this is just a quote from William Hornaday about the year 1922 and what it was like at the zoo that year. Zoologically, the year 1922 closed for us in a blaze of glory. Financially, it closed in sackcloth and ashes. So things were great with the park, but financially things were rough, as they sometimes tend to be. So yeah, the big opening attraction for the zoo in 1922 was the Heads and Horns Museum. So basically what happened for the past 16 years, they had collected all of these heads and horns, essentially, of animals. This is a quote from Hornaday. During 16 years of effort, the collection grew enormously, and in a number and quality of specimens. It realized the dreams of its founders, but the general public could not see it. So it was basically sitting in some rooms where it was just collecting, and the board of the zoo basically was like, the society said we need to have the general public be able to see it, and so Heads and Horns was built to display this collection. These are two of the tablets that were just, that were displayed outside of the building, of course, erected by the New York Zoological Society. But the more impactful one is that it was in memory of the vanishing big game of the world. So a lot of the board of the society and the people involved with the Heads and Horns, and also just generally the founders of the society, were big game hunters themselves. And so the way they had approached the Heads and Horns museum was a lot of the animals that were going to be displayed in this museum are either, not in North America, let alone not in New York City, let alone North America, essentially. And what other opportunity will people who are coming to the zoo then? And additionally, there were some animals that were, getting close to extinction and diminishing in numbers. So this was another opportunity to just have them on, in essence, just saving the memory of these animals before they would potentially disappear. Can go next. Right, and so the Heads and Horns Museum was then organized in two different ways inside. There was two halls. One was zoological and one was geographical. This is an example of the zoological one, where in Hornaday's words, it was arranged by systems of nature, which just basically meant the scientific taxonomy. So as you can see here, this is just a bunch of antelopes and related species that are mounted in the museum here. And then next, this is a geographical hall example. So you can see this is divided up by regions. So there's South America, you can see North America here. They also had sections for Europe, Asia, and Africa. And next. And here's a little bit of a pulled back view of the museum and what it looked like inside. And yeah, it opened in May. That's fine. Yeah, we can go on. Thanks. So the other kind of major event to happen at the Bronx Zoo in 1922 is, for the first time ever, a duck-billed platypus was in a zoo outside of Australia. So the platypus came over via boat by Ellis S. Joseph. The platypus came from Sydney, and Joseph was kind of the one who ended up kind of being its caregiver, being its keeper while the platypus was at the zoo. This was a sign that was put up outside of the entrance to the exhibit, telling everyone to stay quiet. The head keeper, who was Joseph, would be telling visitors why they would have to be quiet, explaining things about the platypus. And it was a really popular attraction, as you would guess, for an animal not seen outside of Australia. And this is a picture of the crowds waiting to go in and see the platypus. And here's some school children being shown the platypus. They're just generally excited to be there, and one of the keepers with the platypus. And then next, one of the department heads at the time was Raymond Ditmars. Though he was the reptile curator, he seemed to have some other interests. And while I was looking through information about 1922, I found this kind of fun story about how he was interested in fingerprints. And so he visited the Department of Criminal Records at the New York Police headquarters, kind of became friendly with one of the detectives, Sergeant Hammersley, it seems, and was able to get some materials for fingerprinting, took it back to the zoo. He fingerprinted one of the orangutans that was at the zoo and a human. I don't know if it was himself or someone else, and then took it back to police headquarters, and everyone who worked there and specialized in fingerprinting and trying to identify these things could not tell the difference between which fingerprint was that of a human and which one was that of the orangutan. So that was kind of an interesting thing to see what the curators were also kind of researching and exploring at the time, other than their main work, since this was definitely not exactly what Ditmars was usually doing as reptile curator. And then moving on to the New York Aquarium. So back in 1922, the New York Aquarium was actually located in Battery Park at Castle Garden. This is kind of a picture of the, that was like a mock-up when they were thinking about doing some renovations to the aquarium that year, adding to it another floor. And because of its location at Battery Park, as you can see, it's a frequently visited area even today, but it's also obviously back in 1922, because of a lot of the foot traffic, there's people being around the park. It had a really high attendance rate just because of its location. It was also a nice aquarium to have down there, but this is, we didn't have an exact picture from 1922, but this is kind of close and kind of representative of what it was like back then to go see at the aquarium. Also, the aquarium had a little well boat that would be taken out to collect animals for the collection. It was called the Seahorse, and this is a picture of it. And then next is one of the animals that the Seahorse was able to get. So sharks were a little bit elusive and a mystery still in regards to being able to collect for the aquarium. They were still trying to figure out what their migration patterns and everything was, but because they were able to go out onto this boat, they kind of were able to observe that, and they were able to get a sand shark and some other smaller sharks and fish that are always going along with sharks, specifically pilot fish, and have a nice exhibit of those sharks and fish, and those were very popular at the aquarium as well. This was just a little blurb about a lot of filming took place in the aquarium. This was in the annual report. There wasn't explicit mention of which films, but several film producers had come by and filmed movies at the aquarium, which I think is a nice indication of how not just like it was a popular location, but also it was attractive for movies to have as background scenes. Okay, we can go to the DTR. Then next is the Department of Tropical Research. So the DTR, or also known as DTR, it was started as a field research department essentially, and then was kind of more refined into an actual department in 1922, where it officially became titled the Department of Tropical Research. They conducted dozens of ecological expeditions across the tropical areas and marine areas. And they had a station in British Guyana at Cartabo that they did a lot of work at. That was just really great for early ecological expeditions. And one of the things they're known for is the artists that went on these expeditions with them. They were drawing the landscapes, the flora, the fauna, everything they were kind of seeing while they were out on these trips. And they had a couple months in 1922 where they went out to a few different places like Venezuela, Trinidad, Tobago, also specifically Little Tobago, which is also known as Bird of Paradise Island. It's basically where bird of paradise birds are in abundance. William Beebe was really interested in learning more about them, especially because he was the Bronx Zoo's first curator of birds before going on to DTR. And so during this trip, he was lucky enough to have someone who was able to take them to Little Tobago and observe some of these birds of paradise and get to see them firsthand that way. And here is a photo that was taken of a ray while they were in Cartabo. And there's also an illustration to go along with this to kind of show the work that DTR was doing. We have a really extensive collection of illustrations that DTR worked on that are digitized and available to view online. And this is just kind of an example of the work they were doing, where they would be seeing these creatures and these animals out in the wild, and they were drawing them then and there, so they could have a record of them as well this way, you know, with the more robust color that you may not be getting with the photo. And they could get some more details in there. Like you can see, they drew the bottom side of the ray as well. Okay. And then lastly, one of the kind of big important early works of ecology was 1 Hour of Jungle Life by William Beebe. Basically what he did was between 7:30 a.m. and 8:30 a.m. on March 26th of 1922, he went on a 1 hour walk, 45 minutes, but a 1 hour walk just in Cartabo, out in the area they were doing their studies in, and he documented every single like living organism he saw while he was on this walk. This is just a section of that whole list. It was published in the New York Zoological Society bulletin for that year, and I believe in total this takes up about like 3 pages about of just solid, very small font lists of everything he saw. And it was just a really profound way to think of ecology at the time, just because it wasn't, you know, focusing on one specific species and observing them and seeing what that species did. He went and looked at the entire ecosystem to see all these animals existing together in this like small radius of space during his walk. And it's just a really cool thing he did, and was really important to the early work of ecology, I think. And then just kind of a last statement about how the society felt kind of at the time by 1922 was the creation of these 2 great and influential institutions, and that refers to the Bronx Zoo and the New York Aquarium. Not only provides unrivaled opportunities for the study of living animals of all kinds, which is the essence of zoology, but leads to explorations and expeditions of zoological adventure and discovery in many seas and lands. This, in a few words, is the accomplishment of 28 years of the Zoological Society. So yeah, in their first 28 years, when Hornaday looked back, he felt like thus far everything they've been doing has been in line with what the society had set out to do, and put them in a great place as they were moving on and seeing what the society would be doing afterwards. And so that's kind of a look at New York Zoological Society in 1922. And over to Madeline to take us to 50 years ago.
All right, so buckle up. We're pushing ahead 50 years over to 1972. And like Sana, I want to orient us. I know nobody was around in 1972, so this is all news to everybody. But in case it's a bit of a refresher, to orient ourselves with what was happening in 1972, obviously the Vietnam War. 1972 was the year of the Easter Offensive. It was also the year of the Olympics in Munich and the tragic attack on the 11 Israeli athletes and coaches there. And in another tragic event, it was the Bloody Sunday attacks in Northern Ireland as well. In the US, it was obviously an election year. Nixon took his unprecedented 8-day trip to China in February of 1972 and met Mao Zedong. Later in the year, 5 White House operatives were arrested for breaking into the offices of the DNC and beginning the Watergate scandal. And in the year as well, Shirley Chisholm, who was the first Black Congresswoman, declared her candidacy for president. Obviously, McGovern became the nominee that year and Nixon won. But just a little bit of background where things were at in 1972 in the US. A little further information, some stats here to show you how things were changing between 1922 and 1972. And also to give you a little bit of comparison to today. Obviously, any of these stats, I mean, these are averages and change widely based on region and even by race and ethnicity. So always want to throw those caveats along with these kind of stats, but just to give you kind of a general picture of what the US looked like at that time. In film, it was a big year for film. It was the release of the first Godfather movie in 1972, What's Up, Doc, with Barbra Streisand and Ryan O'Neal. It was the year that the movie Georgia, Georgia was released, the screenplay by Maya Angelou, and that was the first script by an African-American woman to be filmed. And it was also the year of Way of the Dragon. On TV, top-rated TV of the time, we have All in the Family, Sanford and Son, and Hawaii Five-0. And in my opinion, a good year for music. You get the Exile, Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street, Curtis Mayfield's Superfly, Ziggy Stardust from David Bowie, and then Roberta Flack has the #1 hit single of the year with The First Time I Ever Saw Your Face. So looking at specifically what was going on at the New York Zoological Society, again, a quick look at our board here. The board president at the time was Robert Gillette, who had been a member, or was a member of a prominent New York family, the Gillettes. He was an executive with the Chemical Bank, which the family had founded. Probably recognize a lot of other prominent New York names on this list too. And I'll just point to just one woman on the board at the time in 1972, Mrs. Vincent Astor, also known as Brooke Astor, who was a major benefactor of the zoo and helped to fund a number of really important exhibits and projects at the zoo over the subsequent 20 years or so. Looking at staff leads at the time, I won't go over all of these here, although I do want to call attention to the veterinarian at the time, Emil Delancic, as Barbara Delancic is on our call tonight. And also to William Conway, who was the head of the organization in 1972. He came to the New York Zoological Society in 1956 and retired in 1999. Some of you may know his name because he was such a major figure in the Bronx Zoo's history for so many years. And you may also know that he passed away at the end of last year as well. Pulled this quote out of our annual report for 1972. It feels like a little bit of an understatement. Always fiscal problems. In the year 1972 in particular, they were struggling with rising inflation, rising food costs. There were New York City job shortages and freezes. And it was also to the detriment of zoo and aquarium attendance, the rainiest year in the history of the organization. There was over 67 inches of rain fell in that year, which always affects attendance at the park. So it was a bit of a rough year. This is a map from just before 1972. It's probably from 1971. And just to orient you, over here on our right side, you'll see where the Fountain Circle is, the main court up here in the middle, our Asia Gate down here at the bottom left, Southern Boulevard parking lot up here at the top left. What you won't see on this map is what opened in 1972, and that is the World of Birds. So the World of Birds exhibit opened in June of 1972. You may be familiar with the exhibit, and it's kind of crazy brutalist architecture. It was really highly acclaimed, the architecture at the time. There was a terrific write-up of it in the New York Times from the architecture critic and others there. And it was highly acclaimed by visitors too, and it continues to be. Visitors really loved the exhibit and continue to love this exhibit. It was a huge draw for visitors within that year. And it was really just this incredibly, and again, I keep using past tense, but it should also be present always as well, incredibly innovative exhibit. It created spaces for birds to fly around in the open air. Again, I'm sure many of you have visited the World of Birds and are familiar with what I'm describing. Created or recreated natural habitats that birds would have been living in, including grasslands and tropical forests. And just allowed visitors to have this really immersive experience in the building with the birds. It was also a success for breeding too. They saw a great rise in the number of breeding pairs from the bird collection after the World of Birds opened, and also breeding success for threatened and endangered animals too. The pink pigeon, for example, is one of them that they had great success with in the 1980s from the World of Birds. And, you know, the credit for this exhibit, its innovation really goes to Dr. Conway, William Conway, who's shown here. We will be celebrating the World of Birds 50th anniversary later this year, so stay tuned for more news on that out of the Bronx Zoo about some of the events and activities that will be happening around that. Elsewhere in the park, the herpetology department in that year sent 21 alligators off to the Everglades National Park for rewilding purposes. As you may know, American alligators were threatened at that time because of the wildlife trade in their skins. And the Zoological Society staff had actually been really instrumental in helping to pass policies at the end of the 60s and the early 70s to help prevent the continued threats to alligators and the sale of their skin. The zoo also had a number of activities going on, a lot of construction happening at the time. This map is from a few years later in the decade, probably 77 or 78. But in 1973, they were also working on the South America exhibit, which you'll see up there in your upper left corner, kind of above where the giraffes are now. And you'll also see that big black line running through the zoo too. That was the Skyfari exhibit, which they were planning for in 1970, or the Skyfari ride, I should say. They were planning for that in 1972, and it opened in 1973. It was a great year for the Children's Zoo at the Bronx Zoo. They had their highest attendance of any year. They had, I believe it was over 403,000 visitors come through the Children's Zoo. And they had these, in that year, they had these sensory exhibits set up where you could see, smell, hear all of these senses of various animals. I have no idea what the Smell Me box smelled like. It was not goat scented, I believe. I think it's just a coincidence that there's a goat hanging out on top of it. I do know that the Taste Me box had honey in it, which I can imagine you would not be finding today in a public display because of all of the concerns about honey allergies. In 1972, they also held their first Children's Day at the zoo. It was an annual event for several years. And that year it included music from the New York Summer Festival Orchestra featuring selections on animal themes, including Peter and the Wolf. And they actually brought out a live wolf during the performance. Fortunately, no picture of that. So you'll just have to get a cute boy and a bunny in their place. I'll talk a little bit about what was happening in other parts of the society. So, of course, the Wildlife Conservation Society runs the New York Aquarium. By 1972, it had moved out to Coney Island. It actually moved in 1957, so it had been up and running for 15 years out at Coney Island by this time. In 72, the mural that if you've been out there, you've probably seen along the boardwalk, that was the first year that they painted that mural out there. It's obviously changed a few times since then, but 1972 was the first year for that boardwalk mural installation done by Brooklyn school children. It was also, they called it the Year of the Baby Whale in 1972 at the aquarium. One of the major events related to this was a whale, a pygmy sperm whale had washed up on shore in the Rockaways, a mother with her baby. The mother died fairly quickly, but the baby was brought to the aquarium where all attempts were made to rescue it. The animal actually lived for a full month and received a lot of attention. There were a lot of well wishes and people coming to visit the aquarium to see this baby whale. But he unfortunately did not make it, despite these incredible attempts and efforts by the health staff and by the aquarium staff to keep the animal alive. In happier news, they were gifted a rare golden lobster in the year 1972. Obviously, a black and white photo does not do that golden lobster any justice, so I grabbed this one off the internet to show you how beautiful and strange this golden lobster is that they had in 1972. In 1972, they were also running the Osborne Laboratories of Marine Sciences out at the New York Aquarium as well. This was an experimental research arm of the New York Zoological Society focused on marine sciences. They were really interested in studying marine life with an eye toward what could be learned about health benefits to other animals, including to humans. So they were studying the regenerative abilities of echinoderms like sea urchins and sea stars to help further some cancer research that was happening at the time. They were studying the antibacterial and antiviral properties of sponges and the adhesive abilities of barnacles for various purposes, including for dentures as well. 1972 also saw the formation of the Center for Field Biology and Conservation at the New York Zoological Society. This had been preceded by a group called the Institute for Research in Animal Behavior, which was a joint venture between Rockefeller University and the New York Zoological Society. That began in 1965, and in 1972, the Rockefeller University side of it split off. That was more of an experimental research side, and the field research side of it stayed with New York Zoological Society and became the Center for Field Biology and Conservation. And in this new grouping, there was funding for 3 research scientists at the start. Those were Tom Strusaker, who was based in Kabale in Uganda, and he was studying red colobus monkeys and other monkeys and studying really the relationship between the ecology and social organization among these primates. He was also concerned with the habitats and the encroachment of logging, the timber industry on these habitats for these animals, and trying to call attention to that. The second research scientist was Roger Payne, who was working down in Patagonia on southern right whales. And the behavior and communication of these whales, and also, again, calling attention to the threats to these whales by the whaling and fishing industry. And then finally, the third research scientist on staff was George Schaller, who was also the director of the Center for Field Biology. In 1972, he was working in Pakistan, India, and Nepal on wild sheep and wild goats. He was coming off the work that he had done in the previous couple of years on snow leopards. And I just love this quote here, imagining George Schaller standing in front of the snow leopard exhibit at the Bronx Zoo and imagining himself being back in Hindu Kush, where he had first gotten to observe these snow leopards. And he was one of the few Western scientists at that time who had gotten to study and observe snow leopards in the wild. His work there also led to the creation of national parks and protected areas, both for snow leopards and their prey. And in 1972, I'll also mention Schaller published his Serengeti lion book, describing studies that he had done in the late 60s on lions. And that book would go on to win the National Book Award in 1973. They set this very modest goal for themselves in 1972 that I think they have since fulfilled, succeeded on many times over. That Center for Field Biology changed names a few times, but it essentially is the direct predecessor of WCS's Global Conservation Program today, which, as I mentioned, operates in nearly 60 countries all over the world and in all of the oceans as well. So there's been quite a growth from where they first started in 1972. Briefly mentioned too, in addition to all of this, they were working with the University of Wyoming to run the Jackson Hole Biological Research Station and supporting the work of scientists out there. So this is all coming from that Bronx Zoo headquarters. I think WCS is very proud of its home in the Bronx, but is, while they have our feet on the ground in the Bronx, is operating all over the world, from Jackson Hole all the way to Uganda. Just a few image credits, and that takes us to the end, hopefully right on time. I will leave this up here for a minute, and I think Sana's going to put into the chat these links as well. But if I think we have some time for questions now. If anybody has any questions in the moment, please feel free to contact either of us at the email address that's here. We have our website listed here too. And as Sana mentioned, you're going to find some digital collections there. We have a few of our collections digitized, including those field research illustrations that Sana was talking about, some historical Bronx Zoo postcards, historical Bronx Zoo maps, and a few other treasures from our collections there. We're on Twitter and Instagram if you're on either of those platforms, and we would love to have you follow us. We try to share things, just essentially great stuff, interesting things that we find in the archives. And I will go ahead and stop it there and see if anybody has any questions.
Excellent presentation. Really informative, a good span of years between the 1920s and 1972. So a lot going on, particularly in the world, a lot of transition. Kind of interesting, that was the rainiest year, 1972. And hasn't surpassed it in most recent years?
It has surpassed it, and it surpassed it a few years after that. I don't remember the exact numbers in years, but that was the most rain they had ever had up to that point.
Gotcha.
And Madeline, three things. Number one, what happened to the sky ride? What happened to the world of darkness? And what happened to all the North American animals, of which they had many? And now you go where they were, and I remember them because I can remember the zoo as far back as 1954. And I have documentary proof, which I can donate, pictures of me that my father would take me to the zoo. And then 30 years later, I would take my daughters to the zoo. And every time I go, my daughter Maria says, what happened to the sky ride in particular? Because it was one of our favorites.
Yes, that is certainly a common question. And I started after the sky ride ended, so I never got to experience it myself, but I know how beloved it was. I know that they also had some problems, some mechanical problems with it, and eventually decided that they were just unable to continue operating it. As far as the world of darkness, I know that there are plans, one of the greatest things about this job that Sana and I have of studying this history is getting to see how the zoo is constantly evolving, and also getting to learn about thinking of the zoo of the future. And I know that the World of Darkness has been part of discussions of renovations and new exhibits that could potentially open in the future. And you had a third question that I'm blanking on now. Oh, North American animals. So yes, there are fewer North American animals than there were in the 50s. In part, this is because when WCS started operating the city zoos in the 1980s and 1990s, so WCS was asked by the city to take over management of the city zoos in the 1980s, and WCS reopened those zoos under WCS's management in the late 80s and 90s. Some animals were shifted around, and those zoos have specialized collections. So at the Queen Zoo, you will find animals of the Americas. So you'll find a lot of those North American animals now out at the Queen Zoo.
Okay.
Other questions?
Yes. Like in regards to the work of darkness, the Rocking Stone was in that area. That's still blocked off.
It is blocked off. I know that it's not always blocked off. So sometimes that building is open for special events. Currently, I know that they used to do some of the Boo at the Zoo activities there, and they would open up the building for that. Again, it's also a great regret of mine that I didn't make it into that building. I started after that, but because I know it was just spectacular. I have been in that building for some of the Boo at the Zoo events though. And at that time, when they have it open, you can go up to the Rocking Stone. It is accessible right there. They have it situated. I think it's and I'm speaking out of turn. I don't really know very much about this, but I think it's a legal liability issue. The potential of that stone possibly crushing somebody. So they have it set up so that it cannot rock anymore. But we obviously have some terrific pictures from back in the day when you could see it balanced up there and how it could rock.
Thank you.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
Hi, from Medlin. Hi. Yeah, 1972 was the big year for me because that's the year I met Emil, and we did do a book called Doctor in the Zoo, which is still around. I think it's not in print anymore, but you can still buy copies of it. And there were lots and lots of changes that took place. There's a blog that Paul Kelly writes, which would be interesting to any number of people here, I think, because he's written about veterinarians in the past. I don't know, I don't have the exact address for that, but you might share that at some point.
Yeah,
Very nice presentation, though. I just loved seeing all of this again.
Oh, good. And thank you for reminding me about Doctor in the Zoo. I just love that book. Sana, could I ask you to put up in the chat the link to Wildview? I should have done that. So we do have a photo, WCS has a photo blog, and again, highly encourage you to have a look at that and follow it. We occasionally do like throwback historical types of posts there. And as Barbara's saying, Paul Kelly, the current chief vet, did a series on all the previous vets for the Bronx Zoo. And you can find all of that there on the Wildview blog that Sana's just put the address in the chat too.
Good, thank you.
Madeline, how many guidebooks are in the archives?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it, but we have quite a few. They seem to slap a new photo on them every couple of years and call it the American Eagle edition or the Grizzly Bear edition, or make some little editorial changes, but not much beyond that. And they did that, nearly every year, every other year. From the beginning of the zoo up through the 50s, and then it really fell off. They did another one in the 70s and another in the 80s and 90s. And now, of course, everything is online.
Yeah.
And the
Madeline,
Animal
I was
Kingdom.
wondering, do you know if the Bronx Zoo hosted Earl Fraser to sculpture the Buffalo nickel? Because I was wondering if there's any evidence of that.
That's come up quite a bit, and there is not evidence of that. They think that it's likely that the animal, that Black Diamond, well, no, I'm sorry. The Black Diamond, yes, was at the Central Park Zoo, that he wasn't part of the Bronx Zoo collection, and that we don't have any evidence of Fraser having visited the Bronx Zoo. I should say too, the city zoos, of course, their histories go back even longer than the Bronx zoos, or at least Prospect Park and Central Parks do. And their archives are held by the municipal archives.
And one time I did see what I believe was a quote from him, and said it was amalgamation of different buffaloes from the Bronx Zoo, but I didn't document it. And I can't find that quote again. And they always like to celebrate Black Diamond, but I don't know if that's really true.
Well, I know, and I'll put in the chat quickly too, this book is out of print, but you can definitely find copies of it around. There's a book called Gathering of Animals by William Bridges, who was the curator of publications for the Bronx Zoo, and he wrote a history in 1974. So obviously in need of some updating. As you can see, lots of things have changed, but he does have an extended discussion about that Black Diamond question in the book. So maybe that's where you've seen it.
One person who did work at the zoo was Alexander Calder, the man who, Alexander Calder, who was famous for his mobiles. He worked in the city in the early 20s, and he came out to the zoo a lot and made drawings of animals.
Yeah, and the organization has a really amazing history with artists. So yeah, and Calder actually did some early renditions of the African plains that I dearly wish we owned. We do not seem to have in our collections, but yes, Calder. I know Salvador Dali visited quite a bit. Oh, we should put in the chat too, Sana, would you mind putting the link to the blog, to our blog? So we have some information on our blog too about some of that history with early artists as well.
Yeah.
I saw somebody had their hand up at one point, and I think I'm not sure we answered that person. Maybe Howard, was there?
Yes.
Howard, hi.
Yes, that's me. Thank you for the great presentation, you and Sana. But my question is this. The Bronx Zoo and the Botanical Gardens, were they ever one and the same? And which came first?
Yeah, that's a great question. They were never one and the same. The Botanical Gardens came before the Bronx Zoo. I think they moved in 91, maybe a few years before, or maybe 94. I'm getting my 90 numbers mixed up. Anyway, they moved in before the New York Zoological Society was founded. So when the society was founded in 1895, they were chartered by the state and given a choice by the city of land above 155th Street, parks above 155th Street. So they looked at a few different parks, Dan Cortlandt, gosh, I can't remember, I'm blanking on the other one, and what was called South Bronx Park at the time. Oh, must be Pelham. South Bronx Park, and North Bronx Park had already been claimed essentially by the Botanical Garden at that time.
Okay. I might mention, I took the grandkids to the train show today, and I was amazed that the train show was, I call it a building show, okay? But it was actually empty. We walked in, there was hardly anyone there. There was more security than people. And I guess that's because of the pandemic and the restrictions. You have to show your vaccination card. The kids had to show they were vaccinated. but it's an amazing thing if you've never seen it. So I recommend
Yeah,
it.
no, thank you for that. And thank you, Joanne, for putting in the dates. I see incorporated in 1891 NYBG, and then it moved in 1894. Thank you for that.
Okay.
I'm a docent there. There's a picture of the
great.
Bronx River behind me. And the reason that the train show is not crowded today is because of the weather. If you go there on the weekends, no matter what the
Yes.
weather is, it is going to be crowded. They have timed tickets.
And hopefully you have already or will make it out next year to the holiday light show at the Bronx Zoo. So they, it was a beloved attraction that was done for many years that they stopped doing and brought back a couple of years ago. And it's just really been spectacular the past couple of years.
Yeah.
Madeline,
Any other final questions?
Yeah, it's Rich here again. I know we talked about artists. C. Paul Genuine was another good artist that found a lot of inspiration in the zoo and many of his works, and he was really close, not that far off from the zoo on Van Ness Avenue. Also, is there any future plans for the future construction or new things that are going to be happening in the Wildlife Conservancy over the next couple of years that you're aware of, or?
I don't think that there's been anything announced yet, but there are always, we have this amazing exhibits and graphic arts department that is always essentially coming up with new plans and looking for funding. The Bronx Zoo is always looking for funding to make those plans a reality. So obviously they've discussed the Monkey House, reopening that building, renovating and reopening that building, kind of the way that they did with the Lion House. It's a landmark property, so the exterior can't be changed significantly, but making some interior renovations to update that and create a new space for animals there. There have been a number of conversations over the past few years. I'm afraid I wish that I had some exciting news to share about a new exhibit right now. But I'm sure you will be among the first to hear about it, because the Bronx Zoo will be very, very, very excited to announce that.
It's Madeline, in Priam Bridges' book, he mentions the three trusts that made up the New York Zoological Society: the Lorillard, Neal, and Rhinelander. Are you familiar with the easements that were put in place that says you had to build so much on so much of these different properties and no more than that? I guess a lot of it is being held up by the funding. But that I found very interesting, because behind the World of Darkness is the entrance to what was the Lorillard estate. Now, Tom Casey and Lloyd Olton, the Bronx Borough historian, mentioned that there was a postcard of that, and you could see some of it in some of the early postcards, that you went up the steps from the Buffalo entrance and you got into the Lorillard estate. And Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, who endowed the Metropolitan Museum of Art, has a plaque on either side of the pillars to the estate. And she says, "We give this land in perpetuity to the city of New York in the condition that we found it," which was 1802. I think her family took it over, and they gave the property over in 1888. They had to, because the city was going to take it otherwise. Is there anything on those facts about the different properties that were used to donate the land?
We don't hold much in our archives as far as those records go, because they precede the founding of the society. I know the municipal archives would have more on that. The gates that are behind the World of Darkness are the lighted gates, and they were put up in, I think, 1901 1, sometime around there. But they deteriorated very quickly. There were, I think, these beautiful iron gates. You can still see them if you're down on the ground, sort of facing the back of the world of darkness. You can see where those gates were today. But the gate itself, I think, was gone by the 40s even.
Yeah, Professor Alton at the Bronx Historical Society said there was as a wrought iron lattice work between the two pillars. And he claimed that that was taken down during World War I for the war effort. I've never seen anything on that. That'd be interesting if you come up with a postcard or something about that fact.
Sure.
Can you give us a little history of the Central Park Zoo? When did that come into being and how is it doing today? I've only been there once in my life and I was amazed at how nice it was.
Yeah, I can give you just a very brief capsule history of it. The menagerie itself, I believe, was founded in the 1860s. Is that right, Sana? Do you know? 1870s. You're testing our knowledge of pre-New York Zoological Society history. The menagerie was started there. My understanding was that it was almost sort of started as like a dumping ground for circus animals at the time. It was thought to be somewhat of a low class place in its early years by some. And in fact, the Bronx Zoo was begun to be sort of the opposite, the antidote to that menagerie down in Central Park. The Bronx Zoo was started to be a place of learning, education, promoting zoology. It was a place that you came to be cultivated. I mean, very much a progressive era institution. And the city took it over in the 30s, reopened it in the 30s. I know that, by the 70s, it had fallen into great disrepair. I think there were a lot of news coverage of how bad things were at Central Park and at Central Park Zoo in those days. I know in part the attention was called to that by even some of the docents working at the zoo at that time. And the city asked the Wildlife Conservation Society, the New York Zoological Society, to come in and take over the management of the zoos. There were various negotiations in the late 70s, early 80s, and WCS reopened the Central Park Zoo in 1988 under Wildlife Conservation Society management. So it continues to be owned by the Central Park Zoo, but is operated by the Wildlife Conservation Society, the staff or WCS staff. And it's a terrific park. If you're in Central Park and you have time to stop in, it's a beautiful little park, especially that tropic zone building. I don't know if you had a chance to get into that one, but kind of, obviously they learned a lot from the world of birds when they built that exhibit.
Thank you.
All right. Excellent presentation this evening, Madeline. We shouldn't wait to have you back. Like I said, I know it was about maybe at least maybe 5 years or more. So I think we need to get you back sooner and not have that long drought of not having you here to present. But definitely a lot of good updates and definitely a good perspective in that 50-year time period. So it was very informative this evening. So.
Well, thank you very much for having Sana and me this evening. It's always fun to talk to you all, and do feel free to contact either of us again at that library@wcs.org email address if you have any other questions.
Thank you, Sana, as well too. Appreciate your footwork and everything in your presentation. So definitely a good tag team performance.
Thank
to say the
you.
least. So,
Thank you so much for having us.
thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Madeline.
Good night.
Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Bye.
Linda was there. Where the hell did she go?